Are you sitting there right now using a PC with an overpriced operating system while you eat unhealthy ramen? Well, I apparently have all of the solutions to your life. Go to Vite Ramen right now and get their healthy protein-filled ramen for 10% off with offer code BrokenSilicon. And then go to CDkeyoffer.com to get 25% off all Windows keys and use Die Shrink to get 3% off everything else on the website. And we'll talk about these sponsors more later. But for now, let's just get on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I'm joined by, well, actually, I believe two co-founders of a game studio, and I really, really actually love any chance I can have to have someone who actually works on games on. I mean, I'm usually talking about future products or discussing the latest releases, and I think having someone on, like I've had someone from Sony Santa Monica, Infinity Ward, of course, Brian Heemskirk's on all the time. And, you know, having as many people that actually make things with the things we like to talk about, I think really grounds the conversation. And so please, Taylor, Jacob, introduce yourselves. Tell us what got you into this. And I mean, where are you from? How did you meet and why gaming?
You want to start, Taylor?
Sure, I'll start. I'll tell it from my perspective. I went to school for business management and architectural technologies. And that was sort of the architecture side of things. Modeling for architectural visualization projects is what got me into 3D modeling. And so I started making assets for a few sort of hobbyists who were making games, and ended up joining a small studio of people who were just working for free, just making on a dream game. And that's where I met Jacob. He was working for Epic at the time. And so we were both on the project as environment artists. So primarily doing a lot of 3D modeling. Jacob was doing a lot of material work for the world building. But that project never went anywhere. We did a lot of the work, probably all the work, and people were coming and going. Devs were coming in and out constantly. And Jacob one day just sent me a message, said, "Hey, if you ever leave, I'll come with you." And that sort of started the ball rolling, and we started talking about working together. Over the next year or so, I think we switched over to creating assets for Unreal Engine Marketplace under the company we founded together in 2016, Infuse Studio. And so we released quite a few packs, which, you know, it didn't create enough money to live off of. So we were still had our day jobs. And maybe a year after that, I think we were at ECGC. And we were looking at some of the games and getting hyped about game development. And we were looking at kind of the games that were being made. And we said, hey, like maybe we could make a game that was sort of, its own focus was on the environments. Maybe we could make a game. And we were just artists at the time, really had no other experience other than creating the art assets. But we thought if we scoped the project correctly and sort of leveraged our skill set, we could create a really meaningful experience that would resonate with people. Mm-hmm. So that, and we liked some folklore about a fox who created the Northern Lights. And what else, Jake? Am I missing anything?
Well, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and then 3 years later, I think we scoped it to like do it in 1 year, and it took 3 years, which is
We didn't really work year round either, because Taylor still had his seasonal job at Ice Castles, so we really only worked during the summertime in the off season. And then when he was doing that, I was doing like just contract stuff that I could pick up here and there. But So yeah, I would say it was really the total like serious like all in focus on the game development time was probably like a year and a half, which was pretty
For the first
decent.
Spirit of the North.
Yeah.
Now, Taylor, you said you were going to do like architectural modeling, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So did you have an inkling that maybe that would turn into game development or not? And by the way, I think this question would be different were you to be 10 years younger, because now Unreal Engine 5 is just used for everything, whether it's a game or...
That's really true. And I actually went back to the university I studied at, and that seems to be the case that they consider stuff like that, especially with what I was doing, which was visualization, where you're trying to create a replica, which is essentially what you would use to present the concept and design of the building to client, to sort of sell them on it or to get their feedback before investing all the time and money. So yeah, I was doing things at the time. The big buzzword was BIM, or building information modeling, where you're building models that are smart. So you're doing shadow. You can do shadow studies. You can do heat studies. Everything has. It's not just like a dumb 3D model. Where it's just.
It can be used for all different types of things.
All sorts of things. Everything has.
This was already starting then. It was already the industry was already kind of turning into that back then anyways, though. Okay.
Right. But it was game development was over here. Architecture was over here. They've since come together, because when I was sort of changing over to game development and learning the sort of pipeline for games, it was very different file types, different everything. Like there's all these things like trying to convert files. And so, it's changed quite a bit, but now it's very similar.
And Jacob, was it always going to be game development for you though, from the start?
Yeah. So I went to college for game animation and design. And that's what I got my degree in. So I knew from the get-go that's what I wanted to do. And I went to a small private school. It was called Living Arts College. They're no longer around now. They're since defunct. So I just always really liked games and liked not only the games, but like I loved like watching like the behind the scenes, like what it took to make, like the games and stuff like that too. Same with, any kind of like visual effects stuff, like with Star Wars and all that kind of stuff.
I think our generation is a product of the bonus content on DVDs. Lord of the Rings behind the scenes, Star Wars extra content. Yeah.
Well, and something that's come up a lot when I've spoken to developers is just a lot of it, whether it's a map creator in Far Cry or Little Big Planet stuff or Halo Forge or like something like that. I mean, it was actually so interesting how many, and I actually miss it, how many games shipped and they were just like, make a map that you can share and we aren't going to monetize it actually. And now that, especially in the past few years, it just kind of seems gone actually, doesn't it? There was this brief time, I feel like, where they were encouraging you to be creative in games. And almost everyone I've talked to as a developer, especially who's younger now, got their starts just messing around in that and then was curious how they could do more.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, I think the last game that I can think of that had like just like a map creator in it was like the original, like the 2016 Doom remake or whatever. Like they had like a thing where you could make maps in that. But I mean, I'm sure there was some after that, but that's the only one that I can remember like seeing marketing for it and hearing about it. But yeah, like now everything's, like Fortnite and Roblox and stuff where, you can...
The whole game is the creation. Yeah, I guess that's true. Those do exist.
It is very different, like you said, and I hadn't really thought about that.
I want to ask this question here. I mean, this is actually perfect to look at this as from 10 years ago, because it's kind of like when you were getting started as well. Like, how do you think things have changed being an indie dev from 2014 to now, 2024? I mean, I remember back with the 360 and PS4, they were like climbing over each other to get an indie dev reveal at or an indie game reveal at like an E3 conference or something. Have you really noticed that? like too, and is there anything about that you can really speak to, like in how these mega companies reach out to and work with indie devs, promote them or don't?
I guess I should start off by saying that I never really thought that I would ever own a studio or anything like that. Like, I always thought that I was going to work for some, big company. That was my dream, because back then all the big game companies weren't seen as such bad entities now, or didn't have such a bad rap publicly, I guess, as they do now. So, everybody wanted to work for all the big AAA studios. But after, I think it was like a year and a half at Epic, I ended up getting let go. And so, and I applied to a bunch of other, bigger studios and stuff like that, didn't get a job. So I just had to make my own opportunities, the kind of thing. So that's kind of how I landed in the indie space, just, by happenstance. But I think that, I guess the indie space is definitely a lot different now, because it's much easier, it seems like, for someone to publish a game.
And how many people are at Infuse Studios now, or Infuse Studio now, technically? Is it just you two? Or I thought I saw on LinkedIn, for what it's worth, that it's like 7 or 9 people.
So technically the studio, as far as employees goes, it's just me and Jacob. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of contractors who are full-time. Some maybe for 2 of them, we'd be their only project at this moment. So they feel like full-time employees. However, we have everyone who works on the project is around the world, and it's just easier to keep everyone as contractors. But yeah, let's say at any given point, there's maybe, I don't even say 7 seems a lot, maybe 6 people who are in the project actively working. Most people are doing anywhere from 5 to 20 hours a week. Basically our composer, he works 20 hours a week. We have a guy doing UI. He's working anywhere from 5 to 20 hours a week. And then we have one level designer who's helping us build out the world. He's full-time, putting in lots of hours. And then Jacob and I are full-time. Then we have our animator, who was on full-time for a couple of years. He's now back to just a few hours here and there. We have some extra programmers working for us right now who are helping us do the optimization and ports for Xbox and PlayStation. So it fluctuates quite a bit. So
that's how Moore's Law's Dead works too, by the way. Just global contractor who, when people can work, they do, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
seems to be more and more common thing for companies to do. So, especially small ones.
What I think is interesting to point out, because I was putting the notes together for this, and of course we're about to get into like the layoffs and like how this is because what just happened is game develop. I think it was GDC or something, and I interviewed a developer who was at it actually. Actually, someone who worked on the Lego Racers game, if you remember that. And he was telling me how that's like all people can talk about there right now. And I was just thinking about how that's always in the conversation, it feels like, when it comes to gaming right now, is layoffs and stuff. But at the same time, I think about how, like, an indie game, technically it's just you two are full-time, but you really have a team. And I would say 30 years ago, an indie dev, I mean, even some AAA games in the 80s were one person, making it for the Sega Genesis. And it's almost like some indie studios, or things that we call indie, are almost AA games. Like, I think SOCOM had a team of like 20 people, 30 people or something. I don't think they were very big. I almost wonder like how much of what's going on right now is just everything's become bigger. And I'm wondering if you think that's, and I'm just asking your opinion here, like, how much of that do you think is that's just what companies did, especially after like the pandemic influx of money? They were just like, well, we'll make every studio twice as big. And how much of that is just like the ubiquitous of like AAA tier tools that you can just download and use now? So it's like easy to scale up quickly at all levels or something. I'm curious what you guys think about.
Yeah, lots of questions there. But I mean, for context, Jacob and I both started our studio because we couldn't find employment. I couldn't find it in architecture. I wasn't getting hired. And so that's why I had the time to start exploring these other options. And that's why I worked for free for another studio for 6 months. And that's where I met Jacob. So we're kind of the mindset, if no one's giving you work, you make work, and you can always be productive. And if you're smart and doing things that other people enjoy, then that can work out for you. As far as layoffs and stuff, I'm not personally affected by it, so it's hard for me to comment on what that means for people. I do, if I go at it with my robot brain and my business brain, and I look at it and I do see these really big companies. They start making money, like you say, they scale up, they get bloated, they realize they're getting bloated, their expenses have exceeded their income, so they cut out the upper management, bring in new management. That management has to look at it and say, yeah, we have more costs than we're making, and then so they have to do the tough call and cut people. But these are decisions that have to be made on a small scale with small businesses. 5 people that might have to fire 1 person, or 10 people that might have to fire 2 people, and large companies who are firing thousands and thousands of people. So I guess I'm empathetic on both sides. Like I see, like the management, they have to make these calls. They have to make these hard decisions to downscale because these companies do get a little bloated. And I think the jobs that are being cut, it's not that these people aren't doing meaningful work. I think they are doing meaningful work, absolutely. But when a company is like an organism and it goes into survival mode, it has to downsize, and you can't ever spend more than you make. It just doesn't. It's impossible. Yeah. So I don't know. But again, this is a very much an outsider's view of someone who's not affected, has not been affected by it. I never got hired in the first place, so props to them for getting hired.
Has it been harder or easier for you to find contract work to help make your games over the past few years? Like in the past year, has there been more applications? And some of this there unavoidably would be because your game blew up. So I mean, there's more people who are going to know about you. But I would think it's been big enough, at least since I met you, Jacob, a few years ago. It's already been 3 years, if you can believe that. With the Carolina Game Summit. So you've been big enough for a while. I'm wondering if all these layoff headlines are happening, there has been more applications or not.
So we haven't actually been really looking for anybody new in quite some time, probably 2 years, maybe a little less. We were looking for a concept artist or something. But I would say that the amount of applications, I'm not sure if that has gone up because of the layoffs or because of, we're a little bit more known, or, they can look us up and say like, oh, they've released a game and, looks good, something like that. But I still found it very hard to find any meaningful applicants, like, people that I would be like, yeah, okay, let's pursue this person. Especially in any kind of programming thing that we've ever posted, Unreal Engine guru kind of thing. It's always been very few applicants, and they really didn't seem like they had much experience. So when it comes to those kind of, I would say it's a lot easier to find artists than it is to find programmers. And I think that, they're really expensive. The good ones cost a lot because they have the experience and they know what they're doing. And they tend to either start their own company and make their own game, right, or they do contract work and make a lot of money doing that, or they work for a big company and get really good benefits and, get good pay. And they're usually not the ones that are cut because, they're sorely needed. So
artists are much easier to understand their skill set and how what they're building.
Yeah, I could see that.
For us anyway, yeah.
Here's my portfolio. You know what they make right away, right?
And we're also artists, so we can understand, but programmers are really hard to know quickly. Maybe after a month or so, you start to, realize. But
one thing sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to say we have sort of an unconventional way of hiring people. I like to basically go on YouTube and whatever tutorials I'm watching, I'll contact them and see if they want a job. That's how we actually got two of our I call them employees, but they're really contractors, but who work for us full time. And and that kind of goes in, these people they don't have jobs, but they're doing meaningful work and they're being productive, and we're, we could recognize that. And so it's almost like their YouTube channel is their portfolio,
right?
And their following is their credibility. So,
yeah, like Sammy, our level designer, his background's in videography, and with the emergence of like all the, I can't think of the word at the moment, like on The Mandalorian with the big screens and the camera that tracks and everything. I can't think of the name of the technology at the moment for some reason, but that got him into Unreal Engine. So, and he started making tutorials or like different little videos and stuff. And Taylor just happened to find him on YouTube and was like, this guy looks like, he's driven, like he doesn't have a job doing this, but he's learning how to do all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And that goes like a long way. If someone is driven, like you can clearly see that like they're willing to put in their own time to understand how this stuff works, then they're definitely going to be a good candidate as being a person to work with or, to hire.
Yeah. Money or no money. They've already proven they want to do it.
Yeah. They can figure it out.
And you can see their personality too. Mm-hmm. Personality's big.
It's funny. I hearing this though, like something I'm also just wondering, like, it seems like there is this ebb and flow in the industry where big studios hire, then fire a bunch of people en masse back and forth over and over. It kind of sounds like you guys are suggesting in the background, there's always people you can hire and there's always a way to make work for yourself. That includes you guys making your own studio. I wonder, again, it's the thought I had today while putting together the notes, like, how much of like these mass layoffs that grab headlines is simply because these companies get money and then insist on funneling it all into one studio that becomes bloated when they should just make a new studio? Because I don't remember if I got onto this idea recently talking to another developer, behind the scenes, or just I heard it in a podcast I was listening to, but there's this idea that came up of like, there's really only one person, maybe two or three, that can really be in charge of the creative direction of a game. And then below that, you're going to have your lieutenants, this person's in charge of this technology, this in charge of that, this in charge of that. And then they can each really only have so many people under them before, like, how do you scale that up? Like at a certain, like you see these studios where there's like one creative genius or whatever, who's like now in charge of 4 different games. Like, you can't be. I mean, I even remember the creator of Elden Ring basically saying that, like, it was a mistake for him to think he could work on 2 things at the same time. It's like, I just can't. We needed to make a new studio. Like, how much of it do you think these companies like Sony or Microsoft need to, especially Microsoft, I'd say, and especially actually Ubisoft and EA, needed to go, hey, example, Assassin's Creed's only going to be this big. Let's make a new Assassin's Creed team. And a lot of them do that. But then sometimes I've heard of like 1,000 people at a studio and then they lay off 200 people. I wonder what you guys think about that.
So the way that Ubisoft works is kind of interesting. They have like the Montreal studio, and they actually have Red Storm, which is here in North Carolina. We had an intern for a while that ended up getting hired there. She still works there as an environment artist. And they have like one in France and, a bunch of different places, and they all kind of interconnectively work on the same games. It's kind of interesting the way that they do it. I don't know if I'm guessing that they have like, a certain amount of people at each studio that all work on the same game. And it's almost, I think that in a way they do that to get like different cultural, ideas and stuff for like put into the games, so that it's not just, one kind of culture situation or something like that. But it is interesting because I do feel like the big companies, like you said, like I've always thought about like Bethesda and like how Todd Howard is kind of like at least he's made out to be, the creative genius behind, all the Elder Scrolls games and, stuff like that. And it's like, how far can you stretch, that? Because like you said, you have the people that are directly under him. He can't talk but to so many people a day.
Yeah.
If everybody is like trying to get like glean information from him, then, having 1,000 people working at that studio, there's going to be wasted time and people doing things that they don't need to do, or they do it in a way that he, isn't really what he wants, or, it's just, it comes to a point where you can't, it just doesn't work. And then working on, I know they try to focus on like one game at a time, but, at this rate, I think I'll probably be 40 by the time we see the next Fallout. And that's kind of sad. So the games these days are just taking longer and longer to make because people have, so much higher and higher expectations, I guess.
I just think it's an interesting thought too, that like the amount of studios I can say so far, we'll see how GTA 6 turns out, like reliably can scale up to like a $1 billion quadruple A game is very few. Usually they fall flat and then the company goes under. But I guess Rockstar has managed to do it. But you'd say they're the exception, though, of course, not the rule. And I can't help but wonder, like, how much of it is not just should you make another studio, but like, did you really need to make this game $70 with $40 DLC so that it's 200 hours long? Or could you have two studios make two games that cost a fourth as much to make, have less side missions, and it's like a $60 game that lasts 50 hours. And actually, most people don't play it 200 hours. So aren't you actually going to make more money if you just do that? And I don't remember if it was like Sean Later and Andrew House who said we need more $40 games, and this is a real issue here. I think this industry is starting to realize that, but maybe a little too late. But I'm wondering what you think about that as well. Like I saw you nodding, Jacob, about like how bloated games are, and we could just make more and probably make more money if you sold them twice.
I think that it's kind of a rabbit hole, making games. Like you sit down and you have an idea of kind of on paper of what you want it to be, and then you're just like, oh, well, wouldn't it be cool if we added this, or wouldn't it be cool if we added this? And then 3 years later, you're still adding stuff because ultimately the people making the games are want to add in things that maybe some game has come out since, or they played some game since they originally thought of the idea, the game design document of their game that they're making, and they're like, well, wait, wouldn't it be so much cooler if it was like this? And you could easily just spin your wheels and go around in circles on these things forever.
When our can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
When we after Spear of the North 1 and after we partnered with Merge and we were got to all the different platforms, Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo, and we had a reasonable income coming in, we did have we were presented with a choice of like, do we scale up? Do we hire employees? Do we do a bigger game? And we talked about it for a long time, but I was a strong opinion that you kind of avoid scaling at all cost at your studio. Avoid hiring people at all costs until it's absolutely necessary. So that way they have meaningful work and you don't, and that way it's fair to the employees you hire that you don't get bloated, you don't get, you don't exceed your, what your limitations are. But then not only that is we're in a position where I want to stay close to the ground. Like that is where my meaningful work is for me. Like I want to be the one creating it. I don't want to be a director. I don't want to be a manager. I don't want to get pushed away from my work where I'm up the ladder so much. There's this tier system down where I'm talking to leads who are talking to sub leads. And I think what companies and studios, what happens ultimately is they start making more money and they feel like they have to scale up. They feel like they have to get bigger to do the next big thing. And I don't think that's totally necessary. I think that actually ruins it in the end. They scale up, they get so big, and then maybe they even sell the studio, or the original creatives on the project are no longer in the project, which I think is another nail in the coffin for an IP is if the original creative directives or artists leave, it's gone. And I think games are an art form and it's an extension of the person who originally created. I don't think it's something that's transferable. Like you might be able to start a restaurant or some other business where you scale it up and then you sell it. But an IP where it's this world or game or mechanics that you developed, where it really is an extension of your own personality, your experience, everything that you've put into it is sort of this game form of who you are, and you can't sell it. And so I think a lot of these major games like I don't think we could name a bunch of games where this happened to. So like for me, it was like Halo. I think the original games were good, but as soon as once you get to like 4, 5, and 6, like it's not the same anymore because it's not made by the same people. And that goes for all games. But so I don't know if all these games are just doomed to die, or we should just accept that, get 1 or 2 games out of an IP, be happy with it, and let's go on to the next thing. Because after that, it just becomes like a product that someone's trying to milk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the only times that we've seen that be really successful, I mean, because I think, like, again, bringing it up, like the GTA series kind of seems to have the same vibes and people behind it all this time. It's just how long they've done it. That same with, Dark Souls through Elden Ring. The guy's still in charge. But then Call of Duty is successful, but it's kind of so vague, actually, about, and a lot of it is like how it feels to play it. And that is something you can copy and paste between games. And I mean, the current Call of Duties have nothing to do with the original ones. So, but besides that, it's almost never happened that they can keep doing it for that long.
Especially if it's something that's more abstract and like games that are more of like a experience that when you go through them versus like, just something that's like a competitive game or something like that. Something that makes you feel a certain way versus like, this is like you said with Call of Duty, like everybody knows how Call of Duty is supposed to feel. This played Call of Duty. So it's easy to, or not easy, but you can transfer that feeling to a different setting and, still feel like a Call of Duty game, which is what they do. And they make a lot of money. So, But
even in the case of Battlefield, they've had to bring in, I believe, some of the original creators back because they were clearly losing it. And EA realized that they need a lot of these original people back.
Yeah.
I guess a question. All Jesse wants is for Maurice to play with her more often. But unfortunately, he just does not give out playtime or kisses for as low of a rate as she does. And I think she's just going to have to deal with that. But do you know what you don't have to deal with? Paying too much for Microsoft software if you go to CDkeyoffer.com. This piece of content is sponsored by CDkeyoffer.com. Whether it's Microsoft operating systems, Office products, or even many of the latest games, CDkeyoffer.com provides PC gamers with a product this community deserves. Amongst endlessly elevating component costs, fair pricing on Microsoft keys is one thing that we at least should get, I think. And the Moore's Law is Dead team has been working with CDkeyoffer.com for a very long time. And that's because they're good to me, good to Dan, good to about a dozen family members of friends of mine that have used their services. And they've been really, really good, most importantly, to the Moore's Law is Dead community. So support this channel by using offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% off Microsoft software, or you can also use Die Shrink to save 3% off everything else on the website like games. Using either of those codes really helps the channel a ton, and it helps save you money. So use those codes Broken Silicon and Die Shrink at CDkeyoffer.com today. Yeah, let me see here. Clean Sweep writes in. He says, hey guys, this very interesting article on the economics of the game industry got me thinking. Are a lot of the economic problems that the game industry is experiencing just a result of video games hitting the kind of mainstream adoption that movies and TV hit decades earlier? Is it maybe just time to accept that the overall audience growth is going to slow down a lot now, and everything needs to be designed around long-term sustainability? And I think this is an interesting question, too, of like this downturn in the games industry right now, that where you guys seem to be doing fine, though plenty of places are still doing fine. Like, how much of this do you think is temporary and it's going to boom again, and how much of this is just kind of like, it's not a bubble really, but like, look, the exponential growth is over and now it's time to learn lessons about what doesn't work?
Sure.
There was definitely a huge boom during the pandemic years. We saw it. I'm sure everybody else that released any sort of semi-successful game saw it as well. There was just a ton more people playing games at that point. And, it was terrible for a lot of industries, but it was good for the gaming industry. And now people can go out and do whatever they want again. So they're not spending as much on games. And also the price of everything's going up. They might have a little less money to spend on games right now.
So if they're not going to be stuck inside, why would they spend it on that?
Yeah.
I think the market is going to continue to expand. It may be saturated in places like the US or the UK, but in countries like Brazil, people are still doing the PS2 down there. There's a whole world out there, and there's a lot of countries that are still have a low percentage of gamers to population. So I think it's going to continue to increase. Maybe not here as much, but you still ask people when video games are a media just like music or TV, but people still identify as a gamer. But no one identifies as someone who listens to music, or everyone listens to music, right? So it's like maybe when it gets to the point when you go up to someone and you don't ask, hey, do you play any video games? Instead, that question would change to, what video games do you play? I think at that point we know there's.
I think that's already happening right now too. Like, I think nowadays most people, if they ask me, they're like, "What games do you play?" Yeah. And it definitely was 5 or 10 years ago. Like, although even that question is kind of funny to me, because it's like, I'd say we need to get to the point where they say, what kinds of games do you tend to play, or what's some games you've played recently? Like, what shows have you been watching recently? Because if you say, what games do you play, it'd be like asking, what TV shows have you watched? It's like, how much time do we have? But
that's true.
The past 10 years, 5 years? Yeah. And that's kind of one of those questions one of my aunts will ask me, like, what games have you played? And I'm like, well, I don't. What do you want? Be more specific.
Maybe it's something that will just slowly, as time goes on, because really, with most people my age, maybe not my age, maybe anyone 5 years younger than me, I would assume they play something. They game in some way. I might say, what do you game on, or what do you play on Steam, or what? But that older generation definitely don't game. But maybe as time goes on, and people like Jacob and I, or any of us who've and we're 80, then everyone's played games.
Well, it's going to be great for retirement homes too. I can't imagine how much better that would be.
I always wonder about that. I was like, am I going to be like, when I'm 85, and I'm going to be like breaking out the Super Nintendo and be like, check this out.
We're going to be Super Mario Brothers. In a virtual retirement home in the cloud, playing games together with Neuralink.
Taken care of. Yeah, Neuralink. Taken care of by AI.
To bring it back to developing games though that you've worked on, what were let me tee up the question like this. Compressor Earthblocks writes in and he says, hey guys, No, Viz writes in and he says, "Hello, Tom and guests. Can you talk about the quest simplification in Elder Scrolls? Oblivion used to be more vague on where to go and what to do, whereas Skyrim has an arrow that immediately just points you to everything. What was the development discussion behind things like this, in your opinion?" And I'm sure, like, I'm very curious about, well, two things. You talked about bloat. Like, what are things you thought about adding to Spirit of the North that you think you avoided a pitfall that would have cost tons of work that wouldn't have been worth it? But then also, what have you struggled with in terms of like how simple or not simple to make the game to like know what to do or anything like that?
Yeah, game design is tricky. I mean, we went into our first game with a clear expectation that we weren't going to we didn't have the resources. We were limited on resources of what we could do. So we focused on what we could do, which is environment art. So everything, all the direction for the player is done through environment art. There's no UI. There's no narrative. There's no on-screen instructions. Nothing. It's all visual cues, like that are virtually in the world. So I mean, to answer his questions, like, games have changed. And you go back to terminal games. You're typing in the prompt, and you don't have much feedback. You don't have much to go off. You're doing a lot of guess and checking, right? You're like, it's like there's an elf in front of you and a door to your right. What do you like? And you like throw rock. It's like invalid prompt or whatever. But so as far as game design, it's like, okay, do you put an arrow on the screen, or do you spend time training the player to know what they can do? Okay, so an arrow on the screen for me is hand holding, and that's really bad game design. It just becomes a walking simulator. You go here, that's just hand holding. But what you can do, and like what we try to do in our game design is, let's say at one point in the game, the expectation is the player runs, jumps, and dashes across this big gap. Well, you just kind of break it down. Okay, these are all the concepts that the player needs to know, and you need to introduce those earlier in the game. And you slowly, incrementally introduce one thing at a time in controlled environments where they can learn easily. And then you can expect them to utilize those skills in more open environments. So another example would be like in the game, there's a secret crawl space where they have to crawl through. If it was a large room, they might not find it. But if the player gets dropped into this room and there's really like not a lot to do in that room, so they have very few options. Maybe there's something they, one or two things they can interact with, and there's like this window they have to crawl through. And well, in that situation, that's a good environment for them to learn that, oh, I can crouch through small spaces because you've presented it in that way. Then throughout the rest of the game, you can put this, crawl spaces or whatever in various forms or in more complicated scenarios, and they will figure it out, and they will feel good when they figure it out because they did it without a little arrow pointing, hey, crawl through here. It's become part of their tool set. So it's slowly like, you're training the player, you're training them and helping them know what they can do, and they'll be creative and sort of fill in the gaps. But
an example of that, just to give people listening to a very specific one, and this just stuck with my head since I must have played this over a decade ago, was they had, I think it was actually Portal. They had like the commentary you could play while you're playing the game. And one time I went through it, and there's this one puzzle where you walk in a room and then there's a ladder and then it breaks and then you see where you're supposed to go. Yeah. And they said they never want to have an arrow, but they're like, but to figure out the puzzle, they have to look through the ceiling fan. And good Lord, half of the people that walk into this room aren't looking at the ceiling fan. But if we put a ladder, all gamers know you can go up. So they're going to try to go up and they're going to see the ceiling fan. And that's a lot of work though. I mean, actually coming up with reverse engineering how people think and doing it in a way that's fun. I always wondered like if these big games aren't doing that right because they just can't, because it's just too much stuff in the game. They don't have time to think about every quest.
I mean, those sort of solutions like that, like having a ladder break to direct the player's attention, or having, there's so many ways you can direct the player's attention, but the solutions are on the ground, meaning like whoever is building the environment, they're the ones that are going to have that light bulb moment where, they fix it. But if your company is so big and the decisions are being made by someone higher up, they're just going to say, oh, put an arrow on it, or I don't know. But I mean, I really like that example, because essentially that's still an arrow, but it doesn't feel like an arrow, right? It's that you're still asking the player to use some of their.
It's not mindless. You're not like literally just following a floating bubble in front of you. Because
exactly.
And if you were to do that for one mission and it was tied to something in the story, that's cool. But if it's the bubbles in front of you the entire game, are you really playing? Like you said, it becomes a walking simulator.
You train the player to focus on the arrow, and actually it'd probably be a detriment to your game, because the player's going to miss so many other things, because they're so honed in on, these whatever you're using to direct them. Like that becomes their absolute focus. And so they're probably not even, they're probably missing out on a lot of the other things like music and the environment and
I think it also depends on, how deeply interactive is your game. Can you pick up every single thing and put it in your in your inventory, like in Skyrim and stuff like, and, to ask the player, you have to find a potion, or, have to find this thing. And you would have to describe it really well for them to be able to go in someplace and find it without losing their mind, without an arrow on it or in some kind of way, or some kind of indication that like is some sparkles or something to know that that's the thing that I need to grab. So, if you only have a few things in your game that you can interact with, and those are the important things, that then you don't have to really put arrows on top of them or stuff like that. So I think that in some cases it is kind of necessary to say, like, to put an arrow and be like, go this direction, go over here. This is where kind of the area you need to go for this quest. And I don't think that that's a super bad thing. I just think that there have been games where they overly give you too much information and it feels more mindless. Like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, like I really love the aesthetic of that game. I like the setting, but like everything was like an icon, like for some reason on the map before I even got to it. And I was just like, this just takes all the fun out of like, discovering what's here, or like, I know that there's going to be a chest in that building. Like I don't even, just because there's a thing on the map that tells me that. And I think that in subsequent games, they've actually gone and added a mode where you can limit the amount of those icons that are presented to you, because people complained about it. So, if you did want like the more mindless experience of it telling you where everything was, then you could, or you could, if you wanted a more interactive experience, you could turn them off. So, it's good that they listen to that.
Yeah. Well, and if every game does that, every game feels the same. And I'm sure they started to notice that in sales, as well. And also maybe they, just bringing up Rockstar again, noticed that Red Dead Redemption 2 has almost no HUD and seems to be selling just fine compared to, unless you go into Deadeye mode or something, of course. But it's clearly not necessary, like even in a game that's that big.
Yeah, it takes a lot of design to minimize HUD and get it to, because it's all about getting the information across to the player, and what the easiest way to do that is with the HUD. So Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of my favorite games I've ever played. I cried at the end of it, so it was really good. I don't think Taylor's ever played it, but he doesn't have a lot of time to play super long games.
Hey, Taylor, but no one's told you this. Hey, did you know Red Dead Redemption 2 is good? That's one of my favorite games of all time, too. But it's one of those things where I have a friend who's never played it, and it's like, if I tell him, he knows. He knows Game of Thrones is popular, too.
I have a backlog of probably 5 years of games that I still need to play. It's just, when you start making games, you run out of time. And then, anyway, Jacob and I are both parents, and so well, I've got like 2 hours a week tops to play games, which is not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Not enough to keep up on these things.
Used to play a lot more than 2 hours. All right, so I want to switch gears here. Compressed Earthblocks writes in and asks, how do you guys decide minimum and recommended specs for a game? Is it an estimate, or how much testing actually goes into it for the version on PC?
So that's done by usually a third party, like that's hired by our publisher. It's a company that's got like a lot of different hardware, to be able to test, because you have to have a lot of hardware to be able to test that kind of thing. So I don't really remember them doing that for the first game. I'm guessing that it was done just without us even being informed of it, because I'm sure we have a recommended and minimum spec. But I think a lot of times what games will do is, like, if there's a game that's closer to release, that's running on the same like engine, and has the same sort of visual style, that kind of thing, it's not uncommon to kind of like copy those recommended and minimum as a baseline until you're closer to release, and then they actually do the testing on the hardware and all that, because ultimately it's not worth doing 6 months or a year out from the launch, because a lot of performance stuff can change in that time.
And isn't the last part of it is where you polish the performance, really, right?
Yeah.
So
well, the performance is ongoing, all the time, but the change from UE 5.3 to UE 5.4 has seen huge render thread optimizations, just without the developer having to do anything. It's just on the engine side. So, I think Digital Foundry said it was something like 25 to 30% on pretty much like across the board on everything that they tested. That's a huge amount, which is great. So,
I imagine with a game with a smaller studio like yours as well, there's probably less thought that kind of needs to go into it, because the game isn't Cyberpunk. It's not trying to be that insane anyways. And so testing it on a few things, as long as it doesn't melt graphics cards, is probably easier, because then you can just go, well, this is definitely safe. And most people own a card this strong anyways, right?
Yeah. And I have a couple different laptops. I have an older laptop with a 1660 Ti or something in it. And then I have a 4060 a gaming notebook, Asus one that was like from last year. And our development machines are, we have 4090s and stuff in them. But it's good and refreshing to load it up on one of those other lower spec machines and be like, okay, this is what people are gonna experience when you play this, because people expecting everybody to have a 4090 is unreasonable.
Not if you're Jensen Wang, then he's sure everyone will eventually buy one. But all right, so I want to transition then into this question, because again, Jacob, when I met you at the Carolina Games Summit, you gave a presentation. I really liked your talk about porting Spirit of the North to the Switch. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. I'm curious if you could, like, how do I even ask this? Like, what was the hardest part of getting the game to work on the Switch? And I think I probably know what it is you're going to say. But then also, I put out the specs for the Switch 2 months ago. They seem to be corroborated now. I'm pretty dang confident in it. Like, which I guess I'll just say that too to make sure it's fresh in everyone's mind. 1536 CUDA cores, which is DLSS, Ampere plus-ish, mostly Ampere though, really. Architecture at 4 teraflops. I believe the Switch was 256 CUDA cores of Maxwell at like half a teraflop or something. So radically more compute. and it'll have 12 gigabytes of RAM and pretty fast storage. I don't think it's as fast as the PS5 or maybe quite Xbox One, but modern SSD storage, probably with an IO block to help load stuff. Like, what was the hardest part of putting the game on the Switch, and how do you feel about the specs of the Switch 2, if that is what they end up being?
So yeah, for the original game and getting it to run on the Switch, the RAM was definitely the hardest part to get under control. I think the Switch had I can't remember exactly, but it was.
I thought it was 3 or 4 gigabytes.
Yeah, it was a little bit less than 3 gigabytes of usable for the game, because obviously the OS has to have some of that memory. So we designed the game first for PlayStation 4, and then just because we self-published on the PlayStation 4 at first, and then did all the ports after that, which I don't really recommend to do all the ports after, because that was just a rabbit hole in itself. But
you don't have the option to.
Yeah, if
no one's interested in your game, then you have to. But
yeah,
you're saying it'd be better to do them all at once, not after.
As I would say, it's better to do them in parallel with the PC and everything, because the issue was for when we wanted to release on Switch, we had to update the engine version to be on, because the engine version is tied to the SDK that the platform is using, and you can't. So they only take submissions of I don't know, just for instance, say that they only took submissions of 7.0 until June or something, and then from then on they were only going to accept submissions with 8.0. Well, for what that means is, if you're on the sucker that's on the 7.0, you got to upgrade your engine just to be able to submit the game and get it looked at all. So upgrading the engine always has had issues, just something is depreciated, or the blueprints break on something, or the rendering is a little bit different things, and we have to tweak the way stuff looks. So it was a lot of that stuff for a solid year after we decided, or got with Merge and decided to do the ports in the first place. And for some reason, as we were doing those, it was still staggered. So I think we did PC, and then we did Switch maybe around the same time, and then it was
Xbox was really delayed.
Yeah, this Xbox Series X Xbox Series X and S wasn't until they came out that we even were on Xbox. And we also did a PS5 release, and then it was just, it felt like it was never ending, to be honest with you. And we also did, Stadia and Luna and all that stuff, just because, I wasn't ever very super confident in those platforms, but they were willing to give us some money to.
We did have an Amazon Luna deal, which was significant. So thank you for the 2 Amazon Luna players who played it.
Yeah, I think there's always been some skepticism about those streaming services, but man, they still underperformed even my low expectations. It's just these mega companies, they'll just kill something that they said is going to take over the world at a drop of a hat. It just seems to happen all the time. But yeah, so that's also interesting to bring up all these different systems you've been working on, though, because I think a big concern with the Switch 2 is it going to be like the Switch, where you can put a game on there, but my God, a third of them you really can't. And if you can, every time Harry Potter turns around, it's got to load for 2 minutes or something. And Harry Potter, your main character turns around in Hogwarts Legacy. So I think what people are wondering, and what I talked about a lot a few months ago, was if the Switch 2 can at least, I don't have any, misconceptions that this is going to be some cutting edge 4K gaming thing, but like, is it meeting the bar where at least it just barely gets to where it needs to be, where it's not such a pain in the ass to put the game on it? Like, I think if they could clear that bar, it'd be a big deal. And I'm curious if you think, 12 gigabytes of RAM, the compute performance of kind of an Xbox Series S when it's docked, a little weaker, around there, probably better in some ways, worse than others. But the CPU does sound kind of like a PS4 Pro in performance to me so far. PS4 Pro in performance. So not 1.6 gigahertz, 8 cores, but 2 point something gigahertz, 8 cores. I'm curious if you think that is enough where it's not, I mean, look, you're going to have to make some sacrifices to port a game, but it's not going to be remotely as big of a deal.
I would say that if it's comparable, at least to the Xbox Series S, the lowest common denominator of all of the consoles, then it should see a fair amount of ports and support from newer games coming out, just because they're already targeting a lower spec, having to make those sacrifices and figuring that out for the Series S. But being that Nintendo releases new consoles kind of like in between the middle of the life cycle of PlayStation,
they've really dragged
Xbox.
their feet with this one. I mean,
God. Then that's where things get complicated, because that's kind of what we're seeing with the Switch. The current Switch is that it already was kind of a pain back then with UE4, but now it's just literally impossible with UE5. And we're halfway into the life cycle of it. So if they do release the Switch 2 and it is comparable to the Series S, then that means that we're going to have about 4 years of it being maybe not a huge pain, and it being at least doable until the PS6 or whatever comes out, and then it's going to be a huge pain again, because it's going to be so much underpowered compared to the lowest thing that people are targeting to release on. So
you think when it comes out, which, I mean, it sounds like it's early 25, which, by the way, I mean, I think I basically knew full specs of this over a year ago. I was told that people I talked to at NVIDIA were talking about how this thing has basically been done. So this thing, I do think it's almost a different answer if it would have come out late 23 or something, because it's like, well, yeah, but now you're literally in the middle of the gen, no issues. 25, PS6 may come out 2 years after that. I mean, but it still sounds like at least in the first 2 years, it will be easier than the first 2 years of the first Switch, probably. Or do you think when that first, it was 2017 at 3 gigabytes, I think that was still horrible for even 2017.
That's what it's seeming that way. I mean, obviously we don't ever know until we actually get can test the hardware with the software. Because I mean, like I've just previously mentioned, and I think that actually we were going to probably get into this with a different topic, but you can throw all of the hardware you want at something, but if the engine isn't using it to its fullest potential, then that's obviously another issue. Like with the render thread and stuff on Unreal Engine 5 was just not. It was only really running on like maybe 1 or 2 cores, and now with the 5.4 update, they've made it so that it's multi-threaded and runs on more cores and stuff like that. So it's like a huge gain to the render thread. So and like a lot of people are quick to say like, oh, all these UE5 games aren't optimized and all this stuff. It's like these companies probably did their very best that they could to make this stuff run as good as they could. It was just like, those limitations that are hard coded into the engine, that unless you have a huge team to spend, half a year or more on to rewrite all this stuff. I mean, these changes aren't insignificant. And then if you have to upgrade to the next version, then, you either have to decide to throw that out or try to merge it, or, you got to figure out what to do with that. So it could just be completely wasted if you do all that and then you have to upgrade the engine. And that's why a lot, I think, Immortals of Avium and all that stuff. I mean, they just implemented the FSR 3 frame gen stuff, and that's great. It does help, but that game got a lot of flack for not running as good as people thought it should.
Well, and I remember, I believe after your presentation a few years ago, I asked a question about this, like how limiting was the CPU on the PS4? I don't remember what your answer was. To my memory, it wasn't a huge deal for that game. But now we are 3 years since you gave that presentation, and we are, many years since the PS4 came out. I mean, if the Nintendo Switch 2, because I think I'm trying to remember what it was, like 8 or 12 ARM cores, and they're not the fastest. They're pretty standard ARM cores of the latest, iteration. And I think they're at like 2 point something gigahertz. Like if you're talking about something that, it might actually, I think it will have more RAM than the Series S and actually be better organized too. So it's not split. So I think that's a huge boon for the Switch 2. But if the CPU is notably weaker than the Series S, which it will be, but maybe a little better than last gen, how much do you think that will limit games, though? Because usually people don't worry about that. And I think in a game like yours, usually it isn't a big deal. But do you think by now it will be a big deal or not?
So with the way that rendering works, is especially with the Lumen stuff and the Nanite stuff, it's constantly trying, or what Nanite is constantly trying to, like, the CPU is streaming, content from the disk, from your NVMe or whatever. So it's constantly like reading that stuff. It's constantly updating the Lumen, like, the GI and the level and all that stuff. So there's a lot more going on the CPU just for the rendering than, like, other than physics and things like that you would already think would be happening on the CPU. And so that's where that rendering thread was becoming an issue with UE5. But having a slightly weaker one, I'm not 100% sure how that's going to affect things. I know that UE5 already has issues with shader compilation, like with the shader caches and stuff. There's no real easy way to some games when you launch them, it precompiles tries to precompile the shaders based on what.
For a console, that shouldn't be as much of a deal, though, right? Because
the console. Hardware. Yeah, the console, everything's already precompiled when you build the game, when you make a build of it. But, since for PC, since, you could have, who knows what in there.
Different ones, yeah.
It has to do that, and it usually does that at runtime, like as they're being loaded. So that's where you get the stutters and stuff. And if you load up Fortnite on your computer and you haven't played in a while, it's going to be like Stutter City. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of bad, to be honest with you. It seems like their next focus is probably going to be trying to figure out a way to better ways to deal with that, with the stutter. A lot of people call it like traversal stutter and stuff like that, where there's already all these things going on, and then you go a little bit further, and then it has to load all these things, like the next chunk of the map or something like that. And that extra spike on the CPU is that what gives you that stutter. And I think that's why they're taking the steps now to try to make everything more multi-threaded, to down the road, figure out, okay, how do we deal with these other stutter issues that were being made worse by, the issues with the render thread and all that, not being multi-threaded. So we haven't really done much testing on the Series S yet for Spirit of the North 2, mm-hmm. Because we're still getting memory optimized and stuff. So I can't really say what the performance is going to look like in terms of that, because it does have the worst APU in it.
Is it going to run at 60 frames on the Series S? Is that the plan?
I seriously doubt that.
Because that's where I think it becomes a limitation, right? Most games now run at 60 on the PS5 and Series X. The question for me becomes with the Switch 2, well, if the CPU is weaker, if it can hit 30 at least, I think most people playing on a Nintendo console will make do with 30 frames a second. But if
Yeah.
you have a game, like Spirit of the North 2 running 30 on a Series S, is that because of the CPU? Because if it is, that is a game that I think will struggle on the Switch too.
I'm not 100% sure because we haven't done the testing yet, but just it being less powerful in general, I think because we are using like the full suite of the new features, Lumen and Nanite and all that, and world partitions, all that stuff. It all comes down to how well it's supported, and
yeah,
it's hard to say. I'm really hoping that it would be comparable to the Series S, though.
If the CPU specifically,
yeah. If it can be similar to that, at least while docked, I think that it would be much easier for people, especially indie devs that are trying to make something semi aspirational or whatever, to put a game on. Because I mean, we're making for Spirit of the North 2, it's a big open world. It's 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers. It's completely different in that scenario from the first game, which was very linear. All the levels were, streamed in and out based on which chapter you were in and that kind of thing. So, that's why the RAM amounts are so important as well now, because of all that. You're loading in and out data a lot more than before.
It's interesting too, because I think like the Xbox One PS4 generation happened, and their CPUs were, especially compared to the previous gen, very weak for the time, but they had a lot of RAM, and I think it kind of forced game engines to go multi-threading to some degree, finally. And now the PS5, Xbox Series X have wildly stronger CPUs than the previous generation. And it seems like game engines were like, and we're going to use that CPU, num, all up right away. Even though there's all this talk of we don't need to put things on the CPU. It seems like they've just immediately, the second they were mainstream and powerful, they're being utilized heavily again, right?
I wouldn't say immediately. I mean,
sure.
Yeah, we're 4 years into this development or console life. I would have liked to seen it happen sooner, but I mean, obviously they have to adapt as well.
Now that it's warming up outside, Jessie couldn't be happier to be jumping around every day in the warmer weather. And it's good for me too. Running around with her, teaching her tricks, that's good for my health as well, not just hers. But all of this gallivanting, well, it takes up time and it pressures me to make my lunches quicker to get moving faster with Jessie every weekend afternoon. And usually quick means less healthy. Well, unless you know about Vite Ramen. This piece of content is brought to you by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a healthy, tasty, and shelf-stable food crafted by an American startup that offers a ton of options for eating healthy, like their classic packages that make it easy to add protein and other ingredients of your choice, and then also their Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy microwavable option for those who truly only have a 15-minute lunch break away from home. And I do need to take a second also to remind everyone that they don't just make ramen. They also have Nano Boost Vitality Powder that I honestly think blows away the health powder competition. I literally drink this any night a Broken Silicon is recorded extra late instead of coffee. And they also have a collection of silverware and accessories that are always high quality. Like the Goofy Girl DM Nakiri knife, I tried it out. It is insanely sharp. It is probably the nicest knife this household owns. So not just the ramen, although the ramen's great. Everything else on there is high quality. And that's why I've been working with Vite Ramen for so long. I actually like their products, all of their products, a lot. I've never tried something they made that wasn't good. So check them out. And remember that even just clicking on the link in the description helps the channel a ton, and buying some of the special packs through that link helps you save money and support the channel even more. So support Moore's Law Z by checking out Vite Ramen today. Well, let me ask you this though. What do you think about the rumored specs of like the PS5 Pro, which has been shared all over the place by a bunch of places? Like just the idea of like, it seems to be taking a very streamlined approach where it's like, same CPU, basically same amount of RAM. But we're going to focus on ray tracing, and I think it's technically what is it, like triple the teraflops, although teraflops don't directly equal performance, but there's just a ton more compute and ray tracing in the same amount of RAM. It comes off to me like they're taking this approach where it's like, before we just made everything bigger, before there was this push for 4K, but this time it's like, what if we made it so it's the same game? Because if you think about it, if it's the same amount of RAM, the same CPU, a developer like you doesn't have to make bigger assets. You can if you want to try, but it doesn't have to go for higher textures. It can just drive for higher frame rates and turn up ray tracing. I'm curious what you guys think about that sort of an idea for a half-gen console, like one that finally just doubles frame rates or tries to go for higher ones, let's say, and turns up ray tracing a ton versus trying to just go to 8K or something.
It's interesting that the ray tracing aspect of it would assume that you're already utilizing hardware ray tracing in the game on a different platform or something, and then being able to turn that on or use it in the game on the console.
Turn it up a lot, yeah.
Yeah, so Lumen is software-based global illumination, so it's not. You can enable it to have hardware ray tracing, but it's by default is done by the software, which is a bit where you get into it being more taxing on the CPU and stuff like that, because it's handling some of those calculations. And so, for our game, we're such a small studio that, obviously NVIDIA has kind of talked to us and, nudged us to try to support some hardware ray tracing and stuff like that. But and maybe we will at some point, but it's already a huge task to get things looking right with one ray tracing solution with software, GI. And for me to be able to, me or one of our contractors like Sammy to be able to go in and look at all the different locations and make sure that things look right, and then have to do that again on with the enabled with the hardware ray tracing or something. Something could look wrong or be messed up, and that in itself is a huge time sink. I don't think people think about that. Like, someone has to go and make sure that things look right, and the room isn't pitch black, or there aren't weird artifacts or something like that.
Yeah, that was a big thing when level designing with UE5 and Lumen, is the lighting behaves very differently. And so lighting these environments is incredibly different, especially with Lumen. It has to warm up. And then if you move too quickly or you change environments, the lighter's it's still there. And, but then, so it's okay, you can't just turn off Lumen and use something else, because then it's just pitch black. But, they're if we rebuilt the game to work without Lumen, if we had to do that for a Switch 2 port, that would be a substantial amount of work. That would be almost recreating the game, lighting from scratch, and doing it in a way that we would have done for UE4. But it would be completely different. So, and same with, turning, like Jacob said, with hardware ray tracing, and it drastically affects things. And keep in mind, we're fine tuning the lighting a lot. Even particle effects, they have different emissive values at night. They have different emissive values for day. They have different values that scale for different weather patterns. If it's overcast, everything is so entwined that it's if you change one checkbox, or the way the lighting works, all that can break and or at least need to be reevaluated, and you have to figure it out. So there's just a lot.
Because if you're only doing ray tracing or only raster, that's when it's not any harder. Like when they rebuilt Metro Exodus, they're like, all right, we're just going to do it only with ray tracing here. And it actually ran better because they didn't have to make it work on everything. The code was probably cleaner. But you're saying, you have to have a rasterization version of the game still, for sure. Maybe most of people still can't do ray tracing. So adding ray tracing is still like a whole thing, right? And I this is something I've heard from pretty much every developer I've interviewed on here, just whether it's ray tracing or DLSS or FSR. It's like this idea that it's a checkbox. Nothing is a checkbox. Like I've heard someone say they added, I don't remember if it was FSR or DLSS, and then it just broke the lighting in the ocean for some reason. They have no idea why. But like you guys would say that too, right? Like adding anything DLSS, ray tracing, that's a whole other round of QA, and it might be a whole other round of QA every time you update the game.
Yep. Yeah. So we tried to actually implement DLSS earlier on last year, and it worked for the most part, except for the frame generation stuff had issues, and we kind of had to shelve that until a later date, because we were just spending too much time trying to get it working 100%. And we figured we were going to have to upgrade the engine one last time anyway before we released. So we might as well just wait. We're hoping to be able to support FSR 3 and DLSS in the final launch for PC. I don't really know if we want to get into doing that on consoles or not. We're trying to avoid that. Because I know FSR 3 still does have, some artifacting issues and stuff like that. And we do have some pretty fine details on, we have
your art style,
yeah, with our fur and all that stuff, hair rendering. So might not play well with that. But it's not a checkbox like people think it is. And it would, obviously it would be amazing if it was, but I think one of the things we're specifically running into was like with the frame generation was camera cuts, like if you activate something and then the camera cut to something else and then cut back, it just
dolly picture might appear.
It just freaked out and just didn't understand that you were like, because it's like generating a frame in between those frames, and it couldn't straighten itself out back out after that for some reason. And that was like the thing that we got hung up on. It wasn't really anything weird with lighting or anything like that. It was more of for the generative stuff. It would get freaked out and then not be able to get back to where it needed to be. That could have just been on our implementation and not on,
well, I think they've improved it a lot too, like literally just in the past 3 months. So it is definitely evolving. Actually, a question I want to ask you guys, I don't think it was submitted by any of the fans, but it's one that I've seen in gaming, especially PC gaming circles a lot, is this idea that like developers are using DLSS or FSR as a crutch, like that they just don't make the game, this would be part of lazy dev arguments half the time, but like, and that because of FSR and DLSS, now they think they can get away with not optimizing to something. That it doesn't sound like you guys would agree with that argument.
No, all of the guidelines and stuff, like if you look on the documentation for FSR and DLSS, they recommend like a 60 FPS base
for the generated one.
Yeah, for the generation stuff, to go off of. So, if you're running it, you can't just go from like 30 to 60 and it still feel right. And also when you do any of that stuff, when you are using that generative stuff, it introduces a lot of input lag. So you have to then use something like NVIDIA low latency thing to try to reduce the amount of input lag that you've then added by adding in these frames in between. It's fixing problems with, like you're fixing one thing, you're making more frames, but then you're adding input lag, which feels worse. So it looks good, but it feels worse to play. And so then you have to fix it with another thing. It's not DLSS the frame generation part of it. It's definitely not something that I would consider a crutch.
But what about the non-frame generation part that can just give you 20% better performance and sometimes isn't noticeable? Like, is there ever a time where you're like, well, thank God for FSR and DLSS because this means we can let the game run at 40 frames per second and this will bring it to 60? Or do you know any developers who talk like that really ever? Or because there have been some games that have launched And to play, and I've seen these complaints with PC gamers. It's like, oh, to get 4K 120 with a 4090, you need to turn on DLSS. That's unacceptable. Why can't they just optimize the game more? And I don't think that's most games personally. I think it usually just happens to happen with a game that had an issue or just has something in the engine that actually is using more resources than people realize. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering how much you think that is because it's not just FSR and DLSS, but there's XE Super sampling. Unreal Engine, I believe, has their own. Is it TSR or something?
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
Like everyone has one. Is that something you look at and you go, well, this makes it easier for us? Or is it just something that you just see as there and it's a bonus that's added after the game's basically done?
I think that it's so that just from the way that Unreal Engine 5 was built from the start, it's already using the PSSR for the upscaling. That's a software thing, kind of like what FSR does. Obviously, DLSS is hardware based, and that's why it's a little bit faster and a little bit better. But then you're limited to, you have to have that hardware to use it. So but for us, it was like, okay, if this is built in and this is like the default thing that you need to use, then that's not a bonus. That's, a requirement. I can't think of any game on UE5 that you can just play natively at 4K and expect to get a decent experience, because it's expected that you use that upscaling to achieve the desirable frame rate. At least their upscaling that's built in.
So it's not like developer driven at a minimum. It's more of like a game engine driven thing. Or like you see Sony making PSSR as well. So this isn't because developers are asking for it. It's because Sony's saying, we want you to use it to get more performance. Or Epic's saying, we want you to use it. Yeah,
I think that the PSSR thing kind of sounds like almost like a NVIDIA type of, since you can't use DLSS on there, this is a way to use hardware upscaling instead of relying on that software upscaling that's built in. That sounds good. I mean, we obviously haven't been able to test that yet or anything, so I can't make any claims about how it works or anything like that. It's kind of annoying that you have all of these different solutions that basically do the same thing, but at the same time, I understand why. They all NVIDIA wants their, if NVIDIA is going to be selling cards, they're as expensive as they are, then they have to have some kind of features to go with it that nobody else does.
And then everyone else is going to try to create.
And then everybody, yeah, exactly. So it's like, I understand why things are the way that they are, but at the same time, it's not exactly ideal. But then again, rarely things
is
are
anything ideal. Well, that's so to bring it back to the PS5 Pro, though, like, where do you think ray tracing would need to be for it to be like a default for you guys to do it? Because I think what Sony's thinking is like Spider-Man, right? When it on launch at PS5, it had a ray tracing mode and everyone wanted it. And then they actually managed to get like a 4K 60-ish, I guess it wasn't 4K, it was dynamic resolution closer to 1440p, 60-ish ray tracing mode work. And then you see games like Elden Ring, they just patched ray tracing into the game, even if the frame rate's not good on PlayStation 5. They're like, turn it on if you want. And I think Sony looks at that and they go, well, all these developers are adding ray tracing to their games, whether it runs like crap or not. So we might as well, if we can, work with AMD to make the architecture in the PS5 Pro just quadruple ray. I think that's what it said, like from the rumors, like quadruple ray tracing performance. Like, and if we can do that, well, now maybe without any programming, this setting is just running way faster. But I'm wondering, like, where would it have to be, you think? Because obviously you're going to want to have probably a raster version just for PC, because so many PC gamers still don't have a ray tracing card. But if the PlayStation 5 Pro is like actually running ray tracing 4 times better than the PS5, which I don't know where that would really put it, but like, kind of puts it in enthusiast tier ray tracing now, maybe not next gen, but current gen stuff. Like at that point, do you go, oh, maybe the sequel to Spirit of the North 2 or the next game after that should be based on ray tracing, because we've had ray tracing cards since 2015 with Turing. Like basically everyone has one. Heck, AMD's new APUs, Qualcomm's new, Intel's Lunar, like all of them support ray tracing. When the consoles are doing it as well, so let's say like a 4070 or something, and even APUs seem to be able to run ray trace games in 720p. Like, is that what would make you consider making the next game have ray tracing? And it would be only ray tracing, so you don't have to do both? Or like, what would it take?
The way that you just put it, yeah, it sounds like, and I haven't really given this a whole lot of thought because, we're still so deep into working on the one that we are now. But obviously ray tracing was a big thing that was just kind of blossoming when we were starting to really start working on Spirit of the North 2. And it was always something that I kind of wanted to use, but, just the price for entry seems, very high. And the performance, especially with the 20 series, just wasn't that great for the first, generation of that kind of technology. But going forward, if the next gen consoles are probably going to support ray tracing, then I would
that well,
then I would definitely really heavily think about.
And do you think it would be all or nothing though? You're like, oh, now we're just doing it, no raster, so we don't have to, basically do double the work on making sure lighting works.
I think so, because if let's say we launched this game this year, and then it would take at least probably 3 years to make the next game, then we would be pretty close to the next generation of consoles. And if that is what was projected to supported, then
I mean, it might even be double that. I mean, I'm just talking about the PS5 Pro. So
yeah.
But I guess actually this segues into a good question here. Endless Logins writes in, and he says, welcome, Taylor and Jacob. I remember from previous podcast episodes that developers typically always ask for consoles to have more RAM and faster SSDs so they can improve the types of experience they can develop without a lot of headaches. But what hardware improvements or changes would you like to see in the next console generation? Like, what do you think would really make a PS6 be next gen? And this is something I think is actually a pretty hard question for some people.
Yeah, that is a hard question.
I think all the above.
Yeah.
Just make it better in every way.
Yeah, I mean...
What do you think, Jacob?
Pretty much. Like, I never really expected us to run into RAM issues with Spirit of the North 2, but here we are, trying to optimize that.
So it would depend on what kind of game we were making, what we asked for, but we're doing an open world, and so there's a lot of environment assets, and so if we're not very, very careful, we can quickly exceed the VRAM budget, and we're of course by trade environment artists first and foremost, so that's what we love, and so that's probably what we use first. But
how much do you think? Like, right, they went from what was it, half a gig? Was it half a gigabyte in the PS3 to 8 gigabytes in the PS4 and Xbox One?
Was it really half?
I think it was half, yeah. Wow. And the PS3 was split too between two pools.
Wow.
And then they just went from 8 to 16. I think most developers I talked to were like, more would be nice, but that's enough. Do you think 32 gigabytes enough? Because if I had to guess, the rumors are right now that it's 32 gigabytes or something. And I've always had something in the back of my head of like, I really doubt Sony's going to give you 64 gigabytes of RAM in 3 years on a console. But I don't know if 32 is enough. I almost wonder if it needs to be like 40, like just a bit more than 32. I wonder what you guys think. Or if you could make do with only 24 gigabytes or something.
So I have the ROG Ally, and that only has 16 gigabytes of shared RAM. And I run into the issue of a lot of, either running out of RAM or running out of like RAM that's reserved for the video, for VRAM. And, now with the ROG Ally X, they've increased it to 24 gigabytes without really increasing any of the other specs. So that kind of fixes that issue, seemingly for only like $100 extra for the new model. And I would say 32 sounds decent now, based on our current needs. But I'm not really sure. Yeah, I can't really see a game needing 64 gigabytes of RAM at the moment. I mean, obviously, when we are in editor and doing stuff in the world, we have 132 gigabytes of RAM, and sometimes we get close to maxing that out, depending on how much we have loaded. But
every day,
yeah. Just for the because the war partitions and generating HLAWs and all that stuff is a way to minimize the amount of like fully detailed assets that are still loaded in the distance, even though you have nanite and stuff.
The texture streaming or virtual texture streaming.
Yeah, and the new virtual texture streaming, which is really great at saving on memory. But it does add a little bit of cost to the CPU. See, there's that CPU again coming into play. But I think 32 would probably be the next logical step for consoles. And if it was only 24, then I might be a little upset about that, just because it would be nice to see it double.
And you don't think you need like 50, but like, so 40 would definitely be more than enough. 32 is enough. But once you start getting past 40, it's like, I don't know that we would really need that. I mean, it might make your life easier, but do you really need it?
Yeah, and I mean, like Taylor said, it also depends on the kind of game you're making. If, like, I could see an open world game, a big AAA game that could maybe utilize that to its fullest potential if it was like 64 gigabytes of RAM or something. But I mean, Epic's already it seems like they're already, trying to minimize the overall RAM footprint by, adding in these different kinds of streaming things. So I would say that they probably know more than we do. And they're, saying, okay, well, if we want to be able to have, 4K textures on everything, but not have the memory footprint of having 4K textures on everything, then we have to do this. And that's what they've done. So I would imagine that it's not going to go to 64. It'll probably go to 32.
Mm-hmm. That's about the amount of RAM you want. Obviously, a GPU, we just say stronger. But like, would you want it to focus heavily on trying to get to like because it is a balance, right? Like you look at AMD's graphics card designs versus NVIDIA. Yes, NVIDIA on average is better at ray tracing, but AMD tends to have much smaller die sizes they can sell for less. Like they're choosing to have less ray tracing performance so they can undercut NVIDIA because they're not seen as the premium brand. But like, do you think it would be wise to change that with next generation and like have a heavy focus on ray tracing so devs can just make the switch? Or do you think it should still be kind of like probably better than now, but like half of games are one, half of the games are the other? Because that would feel next gen if every game was ray traced or something. So it sounds like you're saying more RAM, obviously, everything else, make it stronger. The one thing I think it was a developer that was on late last year talked about, I think it was an AI developer, that really one thing that will make gaming on a next gen console feel different is having like a built-in AI engine. Which I think, I don't know, like the PS5 Pro does. I think it's more so the GPU just is built to handle AI workloads better than now. And that it could be a situation where that example you said, like there's an elephant in a doorway and you type throw rock and you didn't capitalize it. The AI will be able to go, yeah, he meant that. Okay, we know what he meant. This is close enough. And that maybe instead of like when you're 40 years old playing the next Fallout, it'll go, not 4 canned options responding to someone. Maybe you can just type, let's go raid that camp over there, and it'll go, okay. Like I think that's a thing, if you think that's doable within the next 5 years, that I think would make a next generation console actually feel next gen, is if you just actually have the capability to type directly to a character and have the character understand what you're saying, so that you don't have all of this, Yeah. Well, maybe you could just put on a mic and speak to them, to be honest.
And then it would go voice to text to AI. Yeah, it's very doable. And then after that, it's Neuralink, where you just think directly into it. And that's not even that's very plausible.
One thing we didn't really talk about is how much stronger you want the CPU to be in a next-gen console. And AMD just announced Zen 5. Intel just announced Lion Cove. frankly, in terms of per core performance, they seem fairly similar. But Intel's removing hyper-threading. Chris Risk writes, and he says, it seems Zen 5 will have the best implementation to date of AVX 512 and a consumer x86 chip. But will this affect game development much? How much effort would it be to make a good use of AVX 512? Is there even much low-hanging fruit, or would it require heavy rewriting of the code to make it suitable for vector execution? Let's say that a future PlayStation Portable uses a future Zen chip, and to get the best out of the limited power budget, you have to use AVX 512. Would you expect significant take-up, or to most likely be ignored? And so I have his question, and then just in general, like how important you think the next-gen console CPU being stronger is.
Yeah, so his question, he's much more, it seems much more hardware savvy than me, because I didn't get a chance to look up what AVX 512 was. But I would say that a lot of the, like where he says would it require heavy rewriting of the code to make suitable for vector execution, that sounds like something that, the engine programmers at Epic would have to do, to be able to take advantage of something like that. Not more of, us just lowly indie devs that are just trying to use, what we can. So that's kind of more on, Epic and
things like that is we usually just wait. Yeah. Wait for the next version.
Yeah.
No, but that's such an interesting point you're bringing up, because I think if you're someone like DICE or Rockstar or something, like, now you have to rewrite Frostbite to figure this stuff out. But if you're an indie dev like you guys are, no, you don't. Like because it looks like Zen 5 is, like, generally speaking, 10 to 15% performance boost if you're not using AVX 512. If you are, it's like up to 50% faster. So if that translates even half to gaming, you can bet Epic is going to make sure their game engine is using that for all of their customers being you're one of them. So it utilizes it. And if that's in a next-gen console, every game's going to make use of that. That's actually an interesting point.
Yeah.
All right. I think I got one more question here, if that's all right for you guys. Yeah, I think this is a good one. Swiggles writes in and says, hey, Tom, Taylor, and Jacob, what does the improvement of tech really mean for your current game dev target? Is the improvement in technology while you're making a game less time optimizing and focusing on creative work, or does the hardware just increase the scope and cause more need for optimization at the end of the day anyways when you get these new technologies? For like effects, artist flourishes, let's see. So specific, for your game now and in the future. So he's like specifically asking, NVIDIA comes out, let's say in a couple months, they announced the RTX 5090. If it's twice as powerful as people expected, does that really change anything? Or does it mean that, maybe we will try to add this crazy effect for someone who has this hardware? Or does it not really affect what you're doing if you've already been working on the game for a few years?
Probably makes homework harder.
Yeah, I would say
it makes... Yeah.
Yeah,
sorry. I'll just make one comment. It's just like there's a huge gap between our, what players have on PC, and whatever's the latest greatest just makes it more difficult because we just have more expectations to meet, and really we just want to create a smooth experience, and
for the vast majority of people,
the average Joe,
and that's what I was going to say is that, we've kind of gone the last, since since the 20 series of NVIDIA cards, that we've seen that gap widen so much between the top tier and then the lower stuff that
the 60 class.
It's so much different that you then, you have to design all these things with so much scalability, to try so that the people that do have the lower end hardware can still play the game and it still look comparable to, or run comparable to, the people that have the fewer amount of people that have the higher end stuff. And the, consoles are are kind of the same, where at first they were, pretty comparable to what was out at the time, or at least what you could get, because it was like during the pandemic, at a reasonable price. But now that, we're 4 years into it, they're starting to lose a bit of their, horsepower, so that they're compared to what's, modern. And, it is difficult to figure out, okay, how do we, obviously we want this game to look as good as we can, but we still have to be able to make it scale down to a point where people that can't afford the highest, class of GPU or the best gaming setup can still play this game if they want to, because our game is still more of a casual style game, more of a casual genre. So it really, this isn't going to be really attracting people that are into like competitive shooters and, all that kind of stuff, that want the most, that probably do have really good hardware, to get the best of, out of what they're playing. So we're kind of in that situation where we want it to look really pretty, because that's what, our game is, all about, awe-inspiring, landscapes and locations and stuff like that. But at the same time, we have to have it work for, the average Joe.
And just to put a number on it, by the way, with the original Titan, which everyone freaked out cost $1,000 with Kepler, that had about 2,700 CUDA cores. And then at the time, the 660 had 960. So it's a lot more, but it's like 3 times as much, kind of. Well, now the 4060 has 3,000 CUDA cores, and the 4090, which is cut down more than the Titan was, by the way, has, I think, over 16,000. So we're talking like 5-6 times the compute difference between the top and the bottom. And it used to be 2 to 3 times.
Yeah, it definitely felt like it was not as big of a gap between things as it is now. And trying to make a game where, everybody across the board is happy, that, the people that do have the super high end stuff are going to be able to, play it and appreciate how good it looks. And then, the people that at the other end of the spectrum can still just play the game, it's another thing that, especially indie devs, I'm sure that AAA obviously still has to worry about this as well, but the lower end is always going to hold back what's truly possible for, or what is going to be shipped, I guess, to the public. Because no company in their right mind is going to make a game that only works, that has a minimum spec of a 5090 or a 4090. That would be, not a good PR thing, but also just the amount of people that are going to have a 4090 is minuscule compared to the amount of people that have, 4060s or 3060s or, anything like that. So the lower end is always going to hold things back. And I think that we saw that in the last generation of consoles too, with Xbox being the lower end of the spectrum. It kind of held back some of the things that were done in even AAA games.
I was going to say that for a game like ours, Jacob was saying it's a casual game. So the game and the sort of design language that you choose, I think, will ultimately decide where your players are at. And for our game, most of our players aren't sporting nice PCs, and the vast majority of them are actually on Switch, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly. Surprising because we're not developing for Switch now. Maybe that was the wrong move, but yeah, I want to say our Switch sales are almost 2 to 3 times that of Xbox, PlayStation, and PC combined. It's slowly changing. So it kind of puts in perspective, where people are at and what people actually care about, and or what they can afford.
Yeah. Or what the people who are interested in your game specifically can afford.
Exactly. And so a lot of our player base, they're older, or they're more casual players, or they're playing on their couch, or But our PC player base has grown quite a bit in the last year, and it's still growing. I think at a more steadier rate than.
Do you think that's because of the Steam Deck, maybe?
I'm not really sure.
I'm sure it plays a part. I'm sure it plays a part, but I think, I'm not sure. I think with the consoles, you're front and center for a good while. You have a lot of spotlight. You might have some streaming deals or something, so you get a lot of spotlight, and then you're off the front page, and no one knows about you. Whereas Steam seems to be a little more consistent. I don't know.
Keep reminding people years after it came out, hey, this game is still there, by the way. It is still good. We think you'll like it.
Yeah, they have their wish list system's really good at reminding you when something's on sale too. Especially like if you have the app on your phone. I'm sure that PlayStation and Xbox probably do the same thing, but and I do feel like PC gaming has become a little bit more prevalent in recent years. Like, I guess maybe that's got to do with streamers and stuff like that, and all the kids wanting to
people
to play.
Working from home. They have
working from home. I think people justified it, and I think also it's 2024. We're 4 years into a console gen. I think you always see a somewhat renaissance happen later in a console generation. Like,
that's
people
true.
are like, all right, it's not new anymore. I'm building a PC.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you can put it on PlayStation and PC first, and then I guess you can just put it on the Switch too, and it should be a lot easier for you this time.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping for.
All right. Well, I know I took up a lot of your time here, and I think you had a hard out pretty soon here, Taylor, so I don't want to go on too much longer.
Yeah, I got about 5 minutes.
Please promote your game coming out. I mean, and tell us for a couple of minutes anything you want to about it. I'd love for you to promote it because you came on here.
All right, Jacob, you have an elevator pitch? Honestly, we haven't shared a lot publicly about the game, but hopefully, I don't know what we can share. Join us, join the game, or join our following on Discord to find the latest grace about Spirit of the North 2. We're really doing all we can to fulfill all of our players' their wish list from the first game. So it's a big world. It's a big game. It's probably, I want to say, like 8 times bigger than the first game, at least. This is massively bigger. And but yeah, Spirit of the North 2.
Well, and send me those links. I'll put them in the description for people too, to where they can find your website, the game, and your Discord. So that'd be great as well. And then I'll do my elevator pitch. Just please subscribe to Moore's Law is Dead on YouTube. Everybody, make sure you ring the bell button so you actually see the content that drops. And also remember that if you join the Moore's Law is Dead Discord, the Moore's Law is Dead Patreon, you'll get access to the Discord there, and you'll be able to ask great guests like these questions as well. So please check out that too. We can't do this without our patrons. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. And thank you two both for coming on so much.
Thanks for having us, and thanks everyone.
Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugada as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the about/support page. In the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and John Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Foles, Zijiz, Daniel D, Aaron Close, Jen Rauner, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, Daniel Hyde, GZ Ziggy, MJB1, Hardforum.com, SNES Chalmers, Jerem Ferrier, Valco Malev, Jensen Wayne, Gregory S. Ecker, Sarcastro, Evan Dingle, Chris Rich, Compressed Earthflux, 3DS Boyoid, Halbuma, Shredbird, Toka, Greg Wanchik, Golden Mobley, Semi Malas, Benjamin Cannon, Jonathan, Jordan Simkovic, Julian Leak, The Boss Haas, Blake, Franco Frederic, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Slicky, Stefan Hart, Meat and Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Christine, Travis Gooding, Christopher A. Butler, Mad, Zoot Taylor, Stephen Coates, Neithra Zink, Michael McGee, Greg, Patty Cakes, Amiable Chief, Tommy, Mark Mitchell, Should, Mark Rademaker, James Anderson, Cole Addict, Judson N, Cameron, Wesley Sager, Henry Shang, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Hexapuma, Reginald Ari, Teak Autumn, Jamie Witters, Jeff Settler, Loophole 35, Winstar, JSMH, James I, Raider, Corey Leonard, Little Germany, Shay, Milton, Pulse Media, Melodic Warrior, Dave Schultz, Mac Daffy, Stephen Dick, Chuck Glidden, Brett Jones, Mai Sharona, Austin Haggerty, Justin Bustle, Jofit, Brian Scanlon, Win Wang, Hardlin, Slushbot, Jansen Angima, Joseph Kelly, Himsa Gung, Tails2299, Emil Valverga, John Sisfo 7771, The Forbidden Juice, RB Racer, AC, Brian Wright, Michael Cozy, Dr. J Matt, Alex Vega, Freedy, John Swin, Jola Martina, Kikum, Albert Gunn, Solarize Zeddy, Matthew Marlowe, Time Unveiled, Whodat42, Penta Winter, Rowan McKickey, Cornstir 671, Sprutnik, Jeffrey Gentleman, Angel of Cake, Omega Doge, John Wick, Boomstick, Nick, Zizamania, Curry King 3, Zombie Killer 771, Porcelain Oats, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.